Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Suter. February 24th, 2022, at 3:40 a.m. Kyiv time, Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, they had actually already done it. They already had occupied Crimea. We're going to be discussing that, I think, in a few minutes. But the invasion has led a lot of people to ask about who almost called him Hitler. Not sure that that's inappropriate, but at any rate, Putin's intentions worldwide, his intentions to Ukraine. We've learned a lot about the propaganda and how Russia works in terms of managing the perception even of its own people of how and why it's doing things. And the question became, at least for most Americans, well, do we really want to involve ourselves, and how much and why? To that end, we have a guest on today to help explain to us what has been going on in Ukraine and why it's important. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, retired, is a native of Quincy, Florida, and graduated from the United States Military Academy in May of 1980 and was commissioned as an infantry officer in the U.S. Army. After his first assignment as a lieutenant in Garlstadt, Germany, I want to guess. I hope that's accurate. I hope I haven't murdered it or said something profoundly offensive. He commanded infantry units at the company, battalion, and brigade levels in the 101st Airborne Division, including the 1st Brigade Combat Team Baston in Operation Iraqi Freedom from 2003 to 2004. His other operational assignments include Chief of Operations for Multinational Corps in Iraq in Operation Iraqi Freedom from 2005 to 2006, and Director of Operations Regional Command South in Kandahar, Afghanistan, from 2009 to 2010. He's also served in a variety of Joint and Army staff positions, including Chief of Plans, 2nd Infantry Division in Korea, Aide-de-camp to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and Chief of Staff, 18 Airborne Corps, Director of Pakistan-Afghanistan Coordination Cell on the Joint Staff, Chief of Legislative Liaison for Chief of, I may pronounce that incorrectly, of Legislative Liaison. This man has enough titles that it could tongue-tie anybody. Of the United States Army, and Commander NATO Allied Land Command from 2012 to 2014. His last military assignment was as Commanding General of the United States Army Europe in Wiesbaden, Germany from 2014 to 2017 before retiring in January of 2018. Today, he is a senior advisor to Human Rights First, a nonprofit, nonpartisan international human rights organization out of New York, D.C., and Los Angeles. You can find their link in the description below, and we will be dropping that in the live chat periodically as it comes up. He held the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis and serves as NATO Senior Member for Logistics and Chairman of the GLOBSEC Future Security and Defense Council. He consults for several companies on Europe, NATO, and the EU, and is co-author of the book Future War and Defense of Europe, published by Oxford University Press. Today, he lives with his wife in Frankfurt, Germany. He is joining us from there now. General Hodges, welcome to the show.
Listening to all that reminds me how old I am.
Well, I was feeling old before this show started. Now, saying all that, I feel old and unaccomplished. Thank you for that. We genuinely appreciate having you on. So let me start with the first question right out of the gate. After this has happened, and there's Americans, and this is a discussion we've been having, somebody had suggested to me earlier, we could feed all of the homeless in the U.S. with all the money we've been sending to help supply Ukraine with weapons. Why is Ukraine important? Why should we be involved in any way whatsoever over there?
No, it's a fair question, and it's one that the president and all the members of Congress have to be able to answer to their population. American prosperity is directly tied to European prosperity, and European prosperity depends on security and stability in Europe. Russia, of course, with its invasion of Ukraine and its threats to other countries, including NATO countries, is a real problem for us that affects our stability and security and prosperity. So there's a practical reason right there. Secondly, this so-called international rules-based order that sounds like something you would study in political science class. If you unpack it, it affects just about every American and every European. The international rules-based order includes respect for sovereignty, borders, respect for international law, respect for international agreements, respect for human rights, freedom of navigation. Every one of those affects all of us, and that's what's at stake here. And then finally, the Chinese also do not care much about those values that I just described, and they're watching closely to see, is the U.S., is the West willing to stick together and help Ukraine defeat Russia, where it will be much easier than it will be if China decides to go after Taiwan or to challenge us in the South China Sea, for example. So if we're not willing to do that, I don't think the Chinese will be too impressed with anything that we say about Taiwan or the South China Sea. So that's why this matters.
This started with the invasion of Crimea, and the West did basically nothing. Now, there have been arguments that, again, A, it wasn't our problem, and B, well, at the time, Ukraine didn't really have much of a military anyway and couldn't do anything about it. Was it a mistake to do nothing when they invaded and took Crimea?
So this is what failed deterrence looks like. The collective we, did nothing after 2008, after Russia invaded Georgia. We really did nothing after they supported the Assad regime in its use of chemical weapons against their own people, despite a red line from the President of the United States. And when I say we, I'm talking about the U.S., Germany, UK, France, and others. And then the third failure was after they invaded Ukraine in 2014 and illegally annexed Crimea. I mean, we did nothing decisive. There were some sanctions. The Minsk process started, but it was pretty much toothless, and it did not change Russian behavior at all. So you can almost imagine the conversations in the Kremlin in 2020 and 21 as they're thinking about whether or not to go ahead and launch this so-called special military operation. We had not acted with any decisiveness leading up to this. The U.S., we had our own significant domestic problems with the past election and the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The U.K. was having domestic issues with their own prime minister, and Germany was still building Nord Stream 2 late into 2021. So clearly the Russians are the aggressor here, but failed deterrence. They were pretty confident we would not do anything, and I think that's part of why we're where we are now.
Now, this strikes me as similar to what people have said about World War II, which was, so many countries just sort of brushed it off as Hitler expanded. He essentially thought he could keep going forever. Is that roughly what you're suggesting?
That's exactly what happened. It's very frustrating because everybody that's involved, leaders in every country, could all probably quote chapter and verse exactly, Neville Chamberlain and Peace in Our Time and, people not doing anything when the Germans take the Sudetenland and the Russians or the Soviets and the Germans make an agreement to divide up Poland. We knew all this, but we were distracted, or in the case of the United States, it was like, this is not our problem. And so, yes, I think the same sort of process is unfolding. Should European countries have done more? Absolutely. But the fact is, American leadership is a big part of this. And if it was easy, none of this would have happened. So I recognize that this is complex, and there's none of it's just black and white or happens in a vacuum. But European countries became hooked on Russian gas, which was very cheap, much cheaper than American gas, by the way. And all of us, there are hundreds and hundreds of American companies doing business in Russia while all of this is going on. So it's not like we were not without fault as well. I think the thing is, we here in the year 2020, 21, 22, 23, people are just having a hard time getting their head around the idea that Russia is still a brutal, medieval people with nuclear weapons, that they only respect strength. That doesn't mean you can't do business with them. That doesn't mean we can't play hockey again. That doesn't mean you can't do cultural exchanges. Russia is a large geographic space with endless natural resources. We want to be able to have some kind of normal relationship with them, but that doesn't mean you look the other way. They only respect strength. We know that from about 5 centuries of history. They only respect strength, and this is where we, the West, fell short.
You talked about the global order and the idea that, there's basically a sort of a system of rules in place, and Russia is violating those rules in every meaningful way. It almost sounds like sort of what was often talked about in the Cold War, this idea of, the blue versus red, the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, and the fact that it was really two competing ideologies. Are we still in that state? And how destabilizing would it be in terms of that ideology, but also in terms of, say, grain shipments or the control of ports in Crimea by the Black Fleet? How destabilizing would it be for Crimea and Ukraine to fall into and remain in Russian hands?
So a couple of things. In the Cold War, it was. There were two competing ideologies, but it was not just the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. It was U.S. with NATO, with all of our allies for decades. And it was a successful sort of situation, if you can say it like that, because there was no direct conflict, despite both sides having enormous military capabilities, thousands of nuclear weapons. We actually still were able to have some sort of interactions, and the war was prevented. Hot war was prevented because we demonstrated that we were prepared. We were going to spend whatever it took to do exercises, maintain a force, and the Soviets could not challenge that, would not challenge that. Today, I don't see it as a ideological difference, although it is I would characterize it as a titanic struggle between liberal democracies and autocracy, but it's not like a communist ideology and that sort of thing. I don't think that's what it is. I think you have an autocratic government led by Vladimir Putin, who's been in power now for 20 years and has spent every day strengthening his own personal position, his own personal security, and insulating himself more and more and more. And acting and thinking as if he's entitled to make decisions about the countries around him and what they would call their near abroad, whether we're talking about Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, that like as if this was the 18th century where he gets to have a sphere. And that's kind of what's at stake now. They really he hates this rules-based order where people respect borders and sovereignty and respect international law. And you'll have already spotted, I'm not a lawyer, but I think we know that international law really is what the international community says it is. And so if nobody challenges Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, for example, then de facto it becomes increasingly their territory. So they're exporting grain now that they stole from the Ukrainians. They're doing that out of Crimea.
Well, and sort of the Russian narrative is that, aside from Nazis in Ukraine and various other stories that we've heard, but one of the narratives is, well, Ukraine really has always been, and especially Crimea, it's always been Russian, and so that means that this isn't quite so bad. But the Russians actually recognized the sovereignty of Ukraine in the Helsinki Accords, did they not? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, multiple times, actually. I was talking to a group of German high school students this morning, and they were asking kind of some of the exact same questions you're asking. And, and we talked about the several different times where Moscow publicly, officially acknowledged that Crimea belongs to Ukraine, that the 1991 borders are the agreed borders. This is not something you can just wave away that, well, Khrushchev was a drunkard and he was kind of Ukrainian anyway. That's why he gave Crimea to Ukraine, and then Yeltsin was a drunkard. He didn't know what he was doing, and you can't just explain it away. Multiple official documents and acknowledgments by Russia, to include the Budapest Memorandum, where they promised not to violate Ukraine's sovereignty in return for Ukraine giving up their nuclear weapons. Of course, the U.S. and UK also failed to live up to the Budapest Memorandum because we did not help protect Ukraine after they gave up their nuclear weapons. Now, this historical narrative that somehow Crimea was always part of Russia is exactly the narrative that the Kremlin wants. I mean, they've done a comprehensive job of stealing the narrative of World War II as if it was only Russians that fought against the German Wehrmacht. Obviously, that was not the case. More casualties were suffered by Ukrainians and Belarusians than were actually by the Russians themselves. They were part of the Soviet Union at the time. But Crimea did not become part of the Russian Empire until it was annexed the first time in 1783 or 1787 by Catherine the Great. Before that, it had belonged to the Ottoman Empire or the Crimean Tatars, Greeks, and others. So it became part of Russia when Catherine took it. So, but unfortunately, this is a narrative that a lot of people are willing to accept, that haven't questioned. And so that's part of the challenge here, competing in the information space to get the narrative right.
Recently, you've been talking about the commitment of Western countries in Ukraine, and you've said to varying degrees, with some countries, notably France, for example, strengthening their position. But for the most part, that while these countries, including the U.S., don't want Ukraine to lose, they're not actually really trying to help Ukraine win. Could you explain that position?
Yeah, this is a real problem. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan, and after the first year, we never had a clear strategic objective laid out by any president of any administration. And I mean, this is job one for our elected senior officials to lay out, all right, military, this is what I want you to accomplish. This is our strategic objective. And you saw how we ended up in Afghanistan. The president, who, by the way, I think has done a great job keeping 50 nations together. I'm sure that the Kremlin never anticipated that this would happen, that Germany would be providing billions of euro worth of equipment to support Ukraine's effort. But the president has stopped short of declaring a clear strategic objective. What's the outcome that we're trying to achieve here? He also has stopped short of saying we want Ukraine to win. If the president of the United States would say we want Ukraine to win, then all the excuses about Abrams tank burns too much gas, or it takes too long to train pilots for F-16s, or all this nonsense, that would all go away. And other leaders, I'm talking specifically UK, Germany, and France, I think, and Canada, would probably follow suit. But they're not going to get out in front, I think, on this because they are concerned about being exposed. Of course, the leadership of the Eastern European countries, they have no problem with this. They absolutely want Ukraine to win and say it because they understand what the stakes are. If President Biden were to say, our goal is for Ukraine to win, that means regain control over all their sovereign territory, get the thousands of Ukrainian kids who have been deported, get them back home, and some sort of accountability for Russia's war crimes. If he'd say that, this war would be over this year. I mean, the Russians are really, really fragile. They're just hoping we run out of will. And so the president could, the quickest way to end this and to stop innocent people from being killed, to stop the destruction, is give Ukraine what it needs so they can win now. And I believe it would happen.
Well, it seems to me the U.S. is absolutely strong enough to make that happen, but I think a concern is Russia is obviously a nuclear power, and they've said that they do not want or that past a certain point, Russia tends to, it's been my experience that NATO says, okay, this is the red line, cross it, and we engage. And Russia's sort of like, well, there's a big hazy red fog around here, and somewhere in there, if you go past that. But nonetheless, there's a red line somewhere, presumably, and people, I think, are concerned that if the U.S. is too explicit, I guess, in its support for Ukraine and how much they're willing to do, that Russia is going to increase somehow, and maybe tactical or chemical weapons are going to be involved. Is that a legitimate concern, do you think?
Yeah, of course it is. And I'm sure you're right. I think concern over escalation is a part of why the administration has stopped short of being specific about an outcome and being specific about saying we want Ukraine to win. And look, I'm an old retired guy. President Biden has the weight of the world literally on his shoulders. So he can't be too casual about this, nor is he. But, the Russians threatened us after we provided Javelin, after we provided Stinger, after we provided Bradleys, after we provided, every step of the way, they said, all right, that's it. There's going to be a hell to pay, and nothing happens because they can't. They threaten all kind of hell after we just agreed to provide the Patriot and tanks. Nothing. And now, I love this. They said the other day that with the decision for the U.S. to at least get out of the way so that others could provide F-16s, the Kremlin said this will significantly increase risk. And he said, yes, it will for you, Russia. So I think he's growing more and more in confidence about what we're doing. The Russians have thousands of nuclear warheads. Putin does not care how many innocent people they kill. We've been seeing that now for over a year. But I think it's extremely unlikely that they would use a nuclear weapon. There are zero advantages for them to use a nuclear weapon. Zero. There's no positive outcome for them. But as long as they don't use it, but some guy like Medvedev or the spokesman from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or somebody else comes out about once a week and says something about, well, we're going to have to use nukes, or we're going to nuke London because they're providing storm shadow, that causes us to hesitate. And so, in other words, the Russians see that we deter ourselves every time they say nuke. So about once a week, they trot it out, which tells me that their nukes really are only effective for them if they don't use them. Because once they do use them, then it's over. The president has said there will be catastrophic consequences for Russia if they use a nuclear weapon. President Xi has told the Russians, do not use nuclear weapons. President Modi has said, do not use nuclear weapons. And I think most of the people around Vladimir Putin realize there are no positive outcomes for Russia if they use a nuclear weapon. So, in other words, I think we have overstated the possibility, the risk, and so we're deterring ourselves.
General, I am getting some scratching noise from your mic. I don't know what's causing it, but I'll make you aware there's a scratching noise. So let me ask two or three questions, and then I want to pass this off to Commander McMillan. We do have a super chat. Thank you so much for your support. We really appreciate it. And if you like our content, just even a like helps us out in the algorithm. Share this content and pass it off to anyone that's interested in Ukraine that you think would benefit from this, and that helps the channel as well. So hopefully you can find the content worth sharing with a friend. Cheryl Watley for $4.99 U.S. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, why is taking Crimea important? Do you have communications with the Pentagon? And let me sort of expand on that real quick, because you've said in the past all roads lead to Crimea, and you've been critical of the idea that perhaps, listen, there's a lot of people dying. There's kids dying. Why not say, okay, they get to keep Crimea if it stops the hemorrhaging of civilian lives, and we just redraw the map and say, okay, it's done. You've been very critical of that idea. What are your thoughts on? Again, the question was, do you have communications with the Pentagon, and why is taking Crimea so important?
So, in terms of the Pentagon, do I have communications? It's mainly as part of my job as a NATO Senior Mentor for logistics. So I coordinate with the people there on the logistics side. But I think the point of the question is, do I get special insight from how the Pentagon thinks about things? And no, I do not. In fact, I stay away from classified information for that reason. So anything that I say or do is based on my own assessment and speculation, looking at a map and having some experience. The question about why don't we just let the Russians have Crimea if it stops the killing? I've heard that several times. And on the surface, it sounds like, okay. So let's unpack that a little bit. First of all, you would have to believe that Russia would actually live up to any agreement. Okay, I mean that would be an important element of any negotiation where Ukraine says, okay, we'll stop. You can have Crimea, but you promise not to attack again. Russia, in its history, has never lived up to any agreement unless they were absolutely forced to. And so they're pretty confident that if they do get into a negotiated settlement where they still retain Crimea, in 2 or 3 years, we'll have lost interest, we'll be doing other things, and they'll just pick back up where they left off after they rearm and rebuild themselves. So that alone tells me that this will be a terrible idea. Secondly, why does this whole war matter? These values we talked about at the beginning, the respect for sovereignty, respect for international law, respect for agreements, respect for human rights. If Russia is rewarded with keeping Crimea, which they illegally annexed, and all of the war crimes they committed, what does that say about us? And when we talk about values and never again and respect and international organizations, it means we will have lost all respect, and others would have lost all respect for us. And so then we're going to be dealing with this over and over and over. We know from history, whenever an autocrat or an aggressor is rewarded like that, that's all you're going to get. And then I would ask anybody who says, come on, let them have Crimea. Okay, well, let's let the Mexicans have Texas, or let the Canadians have, Maine, or give Alaska back to Russia. I mean, if it's for the sake of peace, come on. Let's do it. I mean, so that kind of, I just don't accept that as a useful logic in the real world. And then finally, to the crux of the question, why is Crimea so important? When you look at a map of the Black Sea, you can see exactly why Catherine the Great wanted that place to begin with, because it gives Russia a full-time, around the year or year-round access to warm water. So Sevastopol, since the end of the 18th century, has been an important seaport for the Russian and then the Soviet Navy. Because from there, then you can sail out through the Straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, then you're in the Aegean and the Mediterranean, and off you go. So, of course, it's strategically important for Russia, but it's not theirs. That's their problem. They do have another seaport on the Black Sea, of course, Novorossiysk, but it's not quite as good as Sevastopol. So if Russia retains Crimea, and you've got Russian Army, Navy, Air Force, logistics, intel, all these things sitting there on the Crimean Peninsula, it is like a dagger into the belly of Ukraine. That is the place from which they'll always be able to conduct amphibious operations along the Black Sea coast. They'll always be able to threaten the entire southern and eastern part of Ukraine, even after some sort of settlement. And then when you think about the economy, Ukraine has 4 major seaports, Odessa and Mykolaiv on the Black Sea coast, and then up in the Sea of Azov, you have Mariupol and Berdansk. So even after Mariupol and Berdansk, after they are liberated, if Russia still controls Crimea, they block access in and out of Azov Sea. I mean, as soon as they built that big illegal bridge, the Kerch Bridge, that automatically reduced the type of ships that could go up into Azov Sea. So Crimea, or Ukraine, which is a nation that exports grain for millions of people and rare earth materials and other product, their economy is never going to be able to get back up on its feet again. That's why Crimea, I think, is the decisive terrain for this war.
All right. So, and even like Odessa, which is on the other side of Ukraine, would still be easily within. They could be harassed, and ships could be interdicted by Crimea. Is that roughly accurate?
Yeah. It's 300 kilometers straight line distance from Odessa to Sevastopol. That's nothing for a modern navy. And I mean, the grain deal that Turkey helped orchestrate is only possible because Russia has agreed to allow Ukraine to ship grain out because other nations need it in Africa, the Middle East, and in Asia. Why does Russia get to determine whether or not Ukraine can ship grain? It's because the Black Sea Fleet sits right there and is able to stop, interdict commercial traffic in and out of Odessa whenever they want. That's why even Odessa, of course, and occasionally Russia will launch cruise missiles into Odessa just to remind the Ukrainians there that they can do that.
This all makes a lot of sense. I'm sorry, I've been a little distracted ever since you said we could give Texas back to Mexico. I have a thing with Texas. I'm not a fan. I vote for it goes back to Mexico. Tom Wright had a question.
Can I interrupt for a sec?
Please, sir.
I think something that's important to remember is that when the USSR broke up, the military complexes, Sakai Airfield, actually 3 airfields that comprise that complex, the naval facilities in Sevastopol, all of that, had been given with effectively an indefinite lease to the Russians. They had the base that they wanted in Sevastopol, yet they felt compelled to seize the entire rest of the peninsula. So this isn't, I think, a case so much of the Russians wanting that strategically valuable property as it is they want all of it because it then becomes a direct threat to Ukraine and an avenue for expansion to reacquire Ukraine.
I think, Lance, that's a good clarification and further light on this. You're right. They did. I mean, if you remember in early 2014, the Russian Navy fleet, the Black Sea Fleet, was already there in Sevastopol, along with, the few ships of the Ukrainian Navy that were there. And so, I mean, they were already there. And I think that the Kremlin also was starting to get uneasy with the Maidan protests. And when Yanukovych was run out, they may have begun to think that they were going to lose that access by which they had the agreement with the Ukrainians. I don't know that, but you could almost imagine that was possibly the case.
We've had a few
One of the areas, and I'm professionally embarrassed how wrong I was about Russian capabilities. I mean, I grossly overestimated what they would be able to do before this whole thing started. I was never in the camp that they were going to roll over Ukraine in 3 or 4 days. I just thought the Russians would do a lot better. And one of the areas where I thought they would do much better was amphibious operations. I had expected to see Russian naval infantry being put ashore all up and down the Black Sea coast and the Azov coast. And I don't think they did a single amphibious operation, nothing noteworthy. And I've tried to figure out why, and I think it's because, as Lance, as Commander McMillan would know, how hard that is to do. And you have to train. I mean, it's really, really hard. And I don't think the culture inside the Russian Ministry of Defense, on top of the corruption, the culture of training to the point of failure and getting good and developing a joint mindset, that's not who they are. So thankfully, they've been unable to conduct amphibious operations. Otherwise, it could have been much worse for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, I've worked with the Russian naval infantry. We did an exercise in Hawaii with them, and I was one of the ships that was participating in that. And they're definitely capable. The fact that they didn't use their amphibious capability in the Black Sea, I think, speaks volumes as to the lack of confidence in that ability on their part, and also the level of, I don't want to say corruption, but incompetence, perhaps, that nobody thought strategically in those terms of how can we leverage this unique capability, which they didn't choose to do. I think they just thought this was going to be like the Anschluss, a one-day walkover, and they'd be welcomed with bread and flowers. And instead, golly, they didn't like us.
We do have a couple of super chats and some great questions I do want to get to. But what I'd like to do now, actually, since we're here, so we've got questions from Tom Wright, Barry Mundy, and we do have a couple of super chats. But what I'd like to do actually is, since we've actually sort of gone into where I think Lance was going to go anyway, I'd like Lance to follow up on his line of questioning. And so, Lance, take it away. Commander McMillan, apologies, take it away, and then we'll catch up with all of the outstanding business of a stream after that. So, Commander, you're up.
Sure. One thing I do want to ask, and this is more of a historical question than a current Ukraine question, but it ties in, and you segued into this great for me. The question of Russian capabilities. We all presumed they were going to just bowl over the Ukrainian forces. But going back, my recollection on active duty was there was always this kind of overselling of Russian capabilities. And even, when I was in 2003, I'd look at all these claims, the Russians are going to reach the Rhine in 72 hours and all this other nonsense. And I kept saying, they don't look like they can really do that. This is a giant Potemkin military. And the question I have is, why did we oversell it so much? Did we really legitimately believe they were that good? Or is this something that was kind of engineered in order to massage defense appropriations and help the defense industrial complex?
So, fair question and points. I remember as a lieutenant in Germany, it was Gralstedt, which was the only American brigade up in northern Germany. And of course, all of us in U.S. Army Europe during the Cold War, particularly in the 80s, late 70s and in the 80s, the height of Reagan's build-up and getting the military back up on his feet. I still remember being told, hey, the Russians are not 10 feet tall. They're good. There's lots of them. They practice, river crossings. They practice chemical warfare. They have endless amounts of artillery and rockets. So yes, it'll be tough, but the mantra for us was fight, outnumbered, and win. That's why the Abrams tank, the Bradley, the Apache, that's why these things were all specifically developed. But yes, there were cautions against overestimating their capability. And of course, the distance was not so far. We could be at the border, the inter-German border, within about 3 hours. The geography now, of course, is significantly different. We look at their logistics, how miserable their logistical system has been exposed to be. And I think this is because their logistics system was never designed to sustain extended long-term land operations outside of Russia. But that's exactly what they've had to do now for over 15 months. And it's a different thing from supporting inside your own country versus having to operate over contested logistics over lines of communication outside your own border.
Would you say that the degradation accelerated after the collapse of the USSR? Was the level of corruption as endemic back during Soviet period as it is today?
I'm going to say yes, but perhaps it was not as damaging. I had an Uber driver in Los Angeles this past summer, and I noticed he had a little Ukrainian flag in the car there. And honestly, he looked like he was almost my age, maybe a few years younger than me, in his late 50s. And I said, "Oh, so are you from Ukraine?" He goes, "Yes, I am. I'm originally from Crimea." I said, "No kidding. So how's your family?" "Oh, they're fine," and all that. And I said, "Did you see on TV today this video of Russian soldiers stealing toilets and washing machines, putting them on trucks, and taking them back to Russia?" Remember, there was a whole spate of these kind of things that were happening at the time. And he laughed. He said, "Well, of course they were stealing. That's what they do." And I said, "Well, how do you know this?" He said, "Well, because I was a sailor in the Red Navy, and it's what we did." This is before the breakup of the Soviet Union. He said it was almost expected that if it was not nailed down, you were going to steal stuff. It was not uncommon that soldiers and sailors would sell fuel. They would steal tools. They would sell that to get money or to get alcohol. It was the norm, is how the way he described it. This was from a guy who was a young sailor. He had no idea who I was, who had served in the Red Navy. And then when I look at things today, you've all seen the picture of Minister Shoigu's house. Not bad for a government employee. And the 2 or 3 indicators of corruption that have an impact on readiness. Number one, false reporting of numbers. That's a classic way to get money, is say I have 100,000 troops that need to be paid when actually you only have 60 or 70,000, and you skim off the rest. Or in procurement, if you're the quality assurance guy for the Air Force and the vendor provides you something that maybe does not meet specifications, but he pays you enough for you to look the other way, this showed up in a lot of new equipment that was not up to specs. And then finally, in the storage.
No cardboard was a ERA.
Well, I mean, I saw videos of Ukrainians were making fun of Russian helmets. They put it here, and with their fists, they could crush the helmet. Or on Russian tanks, these metal boxes that are covered the deck and the turret of all the tanks. So, of course, those things that are about the size of a shoebox, that's a reactive armor that are designed to counter a shape charge. Well, Ukrainians were opening these things up, and they had rubber inside of them instead of explosives. So this is the kind of stuff. Our soldiers that deployed February last year that had rations that were expired. This is all the result of corruption.
So we know that recently, like today, there's a news bit about there's an uprising in Beograd. What do they call it? The Free Russian Army or something like that has allegedly taken the city. We won't touch on the question of whether or not they've secured nuclear weapons at a nearby base. That's still pure speculation. My question to you is this do you think this is a staged event, or is it a real thing in terms of, is this a PR thing that the Ukrainians did by going into Russia to show, hey, there's no support for the Putin regime, the Russians themselves are rising up against him? Or is this an actual legitimate angry Russian people doing something?
This is a terrific question, and I don't have any more insight than what I have seen in the media myself. So I could not answer, provide any credibility to any of the reports. But the fact that it seems plausible, says something. The fact that Russia might have trouble on its periphery also seems plausible. It is plausible that Ukraine somehow might have helped orchestrate or coordinated something like that, but I'm less confident in that, not just because obviously I support Ukraine in this conflict, but when I try to think, eventually it'll come to light. If this was a Ukrainian fabricated sort of thing, it would give some countries an excuse to walk away or back off on their support, or it would kind of take a little bit of the shine off of what the Ukrainians are doing. Having said that, I mean, every day, multi-million-dollar weapons fly into apartment buildings and murder innocent Ukrainians. So if somebody gets their drawers all twisted up because Ukraine might strike across the border against a border station, or they might support Russians who absolutely hate the government that they have, I don't think that's a big deal. So I don't know.
It's a little critical.
I think that what seems more likely, but again, this is probably not helpful to anybody. It seems more likely that these are probably some Russians that don't like Putin and see opportunity to cause a problem. I mean, you have Russians that are fighting on the Ukrainian side, just like you have Belarusians that are fighting on the Ukrainian side.
So I have a final two-part question. Is too much faith and hope being placed in the presumed upcoming Ukrainian spring offensive? Do you think it's actually going to achieve big results, or is it more likely to just achieve fairly limited results? And a follow-on to that is, assuming this offensive or some offensive in the future is successful, what does the end state for this war look like? How does this thing wrap up, and what is post-war Ukraine and Russia going to look like?
I'm going to intercede here. I want to hold off on that second part for Isandering. Okay. So, but definitely let's do the first part, and then I'm going to, no worries. So, please.
Okay. Yeah, I was about to say, wow, that's the last two little questions.
I only have small things. So.
Yeah. Well, and I'm so proud because I don't ask. I always ask multi-part questions. So let me ask you this very simple question in 16 parts. And
to your coffee.
And Commander McMillan is just coming along great. He's just like he's I love it. So I'm going to ask multi-part. Anyways, apologies for interceding there.
No, look, this is all everything you ask, I think, is relevant. It's hard, and I wouldn't claim to have all the special insight on it. But to the first part, the counteroffensive, first of all, I would not call it a spring counteroffensive. I think this was a media creation. The general staff the Ukrainian general staff is so disciplined. I've been so impressed with them over the past year, and the way they protect information. We know so much more about the Russians than we do about the Ukrainians, which is as it should be. And they would have never said, hey guys, we're going to launch an offensive in the springtime. I think that this counteroffensive, which is coming, I'm certain, will happen when they're ready for it to happen. And I think the objective of this counteroffensive will be, number one, to begin the isolation of the Crimean Peninsula, but also I think they're anxious to get control of Zaporizhzhia and the nuclear power plant to prevent a catastrophe from happening there. Three conditions I think that General Zaluzhny has in mind. Again, he didn't tell me this. This is just my own assessment. Three conditions. Number one, his own forces have to be ready. Will he have enough combat power, armored brigades with tanks, mechanized infantry, armored engineers, air defense, and artillery that can move along with these formations that could penetrate in 2 or 3 different places these long, dense Russian linear defenses? The Russians are spread out over 800-900 miles. Ukrainians don't need, and they're not going to attack along a broad front. I think they're going to focus overwhelming combat power on 2 or 3 places to achieve a penetration that would go all the way to Azov Sea coast to cut the land bridge to begin the isolation of Crimea, and then bringing up HIMARS and other long-range systems that can begin to make the Crimean Peninsula untenable for the Russian Navy, Air Force, all those bases, Lance, that you mentioned earlier. So the first condition, does he have enough combat power to do that? Have they trained and practiced enough? To include with the Leopards and the Martyrs and the Bradleys and Challengers and French AMX-10 and all the other systems that have been coming in. The second condition, of course, are the Russian forces. Have they been degraded enough so that at least at the places where the Ukrainians will want to attack, the defenses have been degraded? That's why we're seeing fuel storage sites on fire, ammunition sites getting blown up, headquarters being blown up. I think there's an awful lot of partisan activity going on in the Russian area that's creating some of the chaos back there. And then, of course, every Russian private knows there's an attack coming, but they don't know where, when, or how. Just like the Germans knew that the Allies were coming in the summer of 1944, but they didn't know when, where, or how. And so I think the Ukrainian General Staff is still working on deception about how they're going to do that. The third condition is the ground. Is it dry enough to sustain the movement and the churning of hundreds of heavy tracked armored vehicles? Because obviously you don't want to get stuck in the mud when you're trying to launch an attack and bypass bunkers and get through obstacles.
That's never happened in Ukraine before.
So that's why I think that third condition is the ground ready. And you're right. And particularly, I had a Ukrainian officer friend of mine who says that the terrain in that part, in that southeastern part of Ukraine, is especially nasty when it gets wet, just because of the centuries, the millennia of how water flows. And so I think those are the 3 conditions. When they're met, I think President General Zaluzhny turns to President Zelensky and says, "We're ready to go."
Any of that sound familiar, Nick?
Yeah, I've heard that once or twice. Well, and Operator Starsky talking about the mud over there and the smell of it and the whole. He also said that in one area, and I think it was in Donbass. He was talking about he actually got taller and he couldn't figure out how or why he was getting taller, and it was because so much mud was sticking to the bottom of his boot that he was actually, like, as he was going, he was gaining like 4 inches. So, and again, we do have a number of super chats. I do want to get to them and some questions, but let me pass this off to Azandering, and we will, well, before I do that, I do have one question, and I'm going to try to dovetail a number of these questions into one, which, given my propensity to compound questions anyway, should be reasonably simple. But we know that they've been taking citizens out of Ukraine and putting them into Russia. First, would you describe what's occurring in Ukraine as genocide? The second, what do you think is going to happen to the children that have been taken and in many cases sold into sexual slavery? And how should the rest of the world respond to this? And as opposed to that ideal as to how should they, what do you think is likely to happen?
So I think it's important that the International Criminal Court in The Hague has indicted President Putin and his Minister of Children's Rights, Ms. Belova, for genocide because of these deportations. So that's a specific charge based on, mountains of evidence. So yes, that's how I would characterize that. Now, of course, this is a tactic that's not new. It's not unique to Putin. As Stalin did this, he moved huge populations from the Soviet Union all over, to include thousands of Crimean Tatars who were sent elsewhere. So Putin's just following along in the dictator tradition of Russia. Nonetheless, I think he and Ms. Belova are going to be held accountable. I also imagine that there will be an international tribunal put together at some level that will go after the specific crime of aggression, which is beyond the jurisdiction of the ICC. I would like to add, by the way, that I am working on an op-ed that'll come out, co-signed by General Breedlove and General Wes Clark, calling on the Department of Defense to support the ICC's request for help in collection of evidence. You know that the United States, Russia, China, and France are not signatories to the Rome Statute, which created the ICC and gave it its jurisdiction. So the U.S. has, for a long time, avoided or has chosen not to do this. But I think it is still possible for the U.S. to at least help with the collection of evidence. And I hope that Secretary Austin will do this. Everybody else in the administration, from the president on down to Secretary Blinken, has said, yes, we should do this. And I hope the Department of Defense will do that.
All right. And I think we look forward to that. I think we'll post that on the Discord when that comes out. So is Andring any follow-up here?
I've got a curiosity question. You mentioned the I get the nice simple questions because I'm just the simple one of the group. You mentioned your respect for the operational security of the Ukrainians. There's been a lot of media reports, and especially on social media, of what are being described as intelligence leaks, and many sources claiming that they're coming from the U.S. What do you think of those? Are they accurate, or is it a bunch of smoke? And how significant do you think they are?
Well, of course, Sharnder, thank you. Yes, yes, and yes. I mean, there have been times in history where nations or governments or armies would intentionally leak information as part of a deception plan. You know, there was a great movie that just came out called Mincemeat about, trying to convince the Germans where the Allies were going to land in Italy, not Sicily, or something. It was something like that. And it involved a corpse with plans that were allowed float ashore, picked up by the Spanish, and the Germans took the bait on that. So, I mean, that was a planned intelligence leak with false information. So, all the things that are coming out, I couldn't tell you how much of what Airman Teixeira's big time, what was spilled out, how much of that was legitimate. Did anything kind of get tacked along with it for purposes? I mean, that's the challenge whenever you're doing the intelligence work, trying to pick through what you're seeing and reading and hearing. How much of this is real? How much of this is deception? How much of this is just carelessness? In the case of Airman Teixeira, of course, there's an investigation going on. And as I looked at the different things that came out, I didn't see anything that was like, oh my God, the Ukrainians are going to change all their plans now. I didn't see anything like that. But it was embarrassing, first of all, that so much information could be attained by such a junior service member. And also, it was incredibly frustrating to read some of the things like where the chairman says, I don't think that Ukrainians will be able to, I don't think this offensive will be so successful, it was kind of some negative things that got out there. Of course, that could be for somebody else's purpose. And it's embarrassing whenever you have a big leak because other countries are like, God dang it, if you share with the Americans, you're probably going to be reading about it in the Washington Post in a couple of weeks. I doubt that anybody is going to back away because they all want access to American intelligence as well, and that this is all part of the price of doing business. My sense, when I saw the leak from Airman Teixeira, my sense was that what we were probably going to find is that here's a young man who it's not so unusual that a junior service member would have a high security clearance, because all of our guys that work in IT, Intel, do certain jobs, you're required to have a clearance, but that's different from having access to information. You know, we talk about compartmented information, need to know, those things are still true. So the fact that he was able to get his hands on so much tells me that there was a serious training and discipline problem in his unit, that there were probably multiple failures at leadership levels of people not saying, hey, what? And in fact, I think I saw something the other day that said he had, in fact, they knew he had been doing things and he had not been properly disciplined or moved out of there. And then, of course, when you start finding out more and more about his background, you wonder, how did he get this kind of a clearance if a proper background check had been done? So I think that's the bigger problem for us, is that discipline within our own system.
Perhaps maybe we should get the all the same people that worked on, you know, the moon landing and who were working out at Area 51. It seems like those are the only areas that we don't have leaks in.
But we got a lot of movies about them.
But no official documentation being released by people who are actually there. One of the most secure things ever.
Good point.
And then my last two-parter, I guess, so we don't run over on time. Super easy. You are the supreme commander of the world, and you want to see a successful end to the war. What would your recommendations be to actually end the war? Would successfully end the war? Obviously, in the interests of Ukraine and the Western world. And then after that, what do you think will actually happen to end the war? How do you think it really will end?
So are you asking, like, what's the plan, or what is end state?
For the first part, just what would you do to end the war? Or if you could get anything at all. And the second one is, how do you think the war will actually end? And because the real world's so messy, so nothing ever seems to go to plan. But how do you think that it'll actually wrap up?
And if I could dovetail into that, you've also said that conditionally, it is possible that Crimea could be returned to Ukrainian hands by August. And so, if you could actually also dovetail that into an answer, because I think that's
I absolutely believe that Ukraine could liberate Crimea by the end of this summer, by the end of August, if the U.S. and the other allies gave them what they needed. And we're talking about primarily long-range precision weapons that could make the Crimean Peninsula untenable. I mean, if they had ATACMS right now, for example, that's 300-kilometer range. That means you could sit in Odessa and make every ship of the Black Sea Fleet either go to the bottom or have to displace somewhere else, because you wrecked all their maintenance facilities, their fueling facilities, so that Sevastopol is not usable for the Russians as a home for the Black Sea Fleet. That would be significant, because Novorossiysk is not as good a port. It would make it much more difficult for the Black Sea Fleet to launch caliber missiles against apartment buildings inside Ukraine. This is a good thing. Same thing with these air bases. I mean, Crimea is about the size of Massachusetts. There's nowhere to hide. Everybody knows where everything is. And so if you've got adequate ATACMS, Storm Shadow, Gray Eagle drones with a 25-hour loiter, ground launch small diameter bombs that have a range of about 150 kilometers, if they already had F-16, I mean, all these different kind of weapon systems, not one by itself, but these kinds of capabilities that would give Ukraine the ability to start hitting these targets inside Crimea, that would go a long way towards making it possible for Ukraine to recover the Crimean Peninsula, make it untenable for Russian forces. So for me, step one, the president says, Ukraine's going to win. We want them to win. It's good for all of us. And to do that, I'm going to get them what they need now. No more excuses about how we don't have enough or, whatever. And that's how it would have to happen. Now, we are where we are. F-16's probably 3-4 months away from showing up in the battle space. I guarantee it'll come faster than anybody claims it will. I heard the other day Mr. Call, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy, said, "Oh, it might take 2 years." That's utter nonsense. That's utter nonsense. But it's because they didn't want to do it. And so I think the administration in this case has been disingenuous. They say they can't give ATACMS because they don't make them anymore. That's not true either. We're still making ATACMS for export. So the step one is declare we want Ukraine to win, and we're going to give them what they need. And then we're going to give them that long-range capability they need. And by the way, to include maritime unmanned systems. Our great Navy, the greatest Navy in the world, uses lots of maritime unmanned systems now. And I think you could imagine the chaos for the Black Sea Fleet if you had high-end Navy drones that were able to get in close to Russian ships. It would make it very uncomfortable for them. So that would be my approach. And then, of course, you have to have maintenance. Right now, the Ukrainians, they call it the zoo. You've got so many different kinds of trucks and howitzers and weapon systems and vehicles. So maintenance, when you've got a wide range of platforms, is very, very difficult because each one has a different line of parts and technical requirements. I would be strongly in favor of this idea of maintenance hubs throughout Ukraine, where let it be contractors. If we're not going to put boots on the ground, let it be contractors that come in there and do maintenance so you don't have to take systems all the way back to Poland or Germany or Slovakia or something like that. Those are the kind of things I would want to, and then, of course, more of what we're already doing, air and missile defense, that sort of thing.
Yeah, supply sergeant has got to be the worst job in the Ukrainian army right now.
Yeah, there's no happy days for the supply sergeant.
So, how do you think this is going to end?
I think
your prediction.
Yeah, and of course, 2 months, call me up and highlight how wrong I was. But I think we should prepare for the very strong possibility of a catastrophic success. When I look at the Russian side, after 9 years of war, and after 14, 15 months now of a special military operation, with every advantage, numbers, modernized aircraft, you name it, and not burdened by any, international law, or basically do whatever you want. They control 16% of Ukraine. That's it. They have not achieved air superiority. Russian aircraft do not want to fly in Ukraine. That's job one for our great Air Force. The line of communication remains basically untouched. I mean, not a single train or convoy bringing the ammunition or equipment from Poland and Ukraine has been hit. How in the hell is that the case? The Black Sea Fleet goes nowhere near the coast. They are terrified of getting near the Ukrainian coast, and Ukraine does not even have a navy. So when I look at the performance of the Russian military, I think I saw this morning that they're only 10 tanks away from having lost 2,000 tanks, by the way. Not bad. The incoherent command structure, they hate each other. I mean, Prigozhin, Kadyrov, Shoigu, Gerasimov, all these guys, and when they hate each other, there's no trust there. That obviously trickles down, and it also means there is no coherent plan. And so I think the Ukrainians have a real opportunity, acknowledging that there will be casualties. None of this is going to be easy, but I'm going to bet on them that they achieve significant penetration in several places, and that they do begin the isolation of the Crimean Peninsula, and that they do get a lot more long-range weapons close enough to be able to make Crimea untenable. And that Kerch Bridge, it stays up, I think, as long as there's a flow out. I think the Ukrainians leave it up so that Russians who want to leave can leave, whether it's civilians, military, whatever. But I think if they start seeing a flow in, then they'll go ahead and destroy that bridge. I am sure they have the ability to do that right now. They're just waiting for the right time, even though the Russians obviously will have taken huge steps to try and protect it. The key is cutting the land bridge to begin that sort of isolation. Bakhmut, the whole Donbass area, you could kill every Russian within 200 kilometers of Bakhmut. That would not change the strategic situation. Liberating Crimea is what changes the strategic situation, and also probably unleashes a chain of events inside Russia. Once Crimea has been liberated, then I think they turn to the rest of the Donbass.
Level 70 for 27.99. How can we change the minds of the Russian people if the war is not being experienced by them, if they are not experiencing a price or the horrors of war in the same way that the Ukrainian civilians are? And to dovetail off of that question, once they've liberated Crimea, presumably Putin can just keep sending rockets over as long as he likes. So you had said penetration earlier. I think you meant penetration into the areas that are currently occupied by Russia.
Right.
But we've now seen there's been an attack on a Russian city. The civilians that are fleeing are going to spread the word on that. In order to finally get this to stop and to stop Putin's ability to just keep throwing attacks at them or whatever, do you think that the average Russian needs to be feeling the cost of this war in some way, and or does that way possibly include hitting more significantly inside Russia by the Ukrainian military?
So another excellent question. Of course, I don't have a sense of confidence about any news that comes out of Russia. All these Russian talk shows. It's kind of interesting to hear how the drama that's going on there and how they're going to destroy everybody, and now they're all worried we're losing, and so kind of interesting, but it's hard to gauge outside of Moscow what actual Russians really think. And I have no doubt that a huge percentage of them absolutely believe that Putin is right. They want to support. But then I think, wait a minute, when the Kremlin announced a partial mobilization last fall, 500,000 Russian military-age males left the country rather than be mobilized. So there is no will to really fight. I don't think you could find many Russian troops that really, really want to be in Ukraine. I don't buy this mythology that Crimea is so holy for them and that they'll do anything, because they didn't. You remember last summer when the first drone hit the base at Saki and all the beachgoers were there, and people like, what the hell was that? And then the next day you see 30,000 cars over the Kerch Bridge trying to get out of there. None of them headed to the recruiting office saying, hey, I'm here to defend my favorite holiday spot. So I imagine that there are a lot more people in Russia that are against this, but they can't say anything, or they won't say anything. But maybe that's what I want to believe. We have, in effect, given Russia sanctuary in Crimea and in their own country, because we have either not given the Ukrainians tools that they can use to reach that far, or we've said we're not going to give it to you if you use it inside Russia. But yet, under the UN Charter, of course, Ukraine is entitled to defend itself. And so I imagine they'll continue looking for opportunities to hit airfields from which missiles and planes are launched against them. But I don't know that there will be a lot of energy and enthusiasm for continuing to launch missiles into Ukraine after Russia has been defeated, because I think there will be different dynamics at play on the Russian side. Belarus is a whole new unknown for me now, with given Lukashenko's kind of status, whatever that is. I think that Putin's number one objective is his own skin, saving his own skin and staying in power. And so if they need to, they will create a new narrative of why they had to pull out of Ukraine.
I just saw it today. There's a source, and it's on the Ukraine Live map, that says that Russia is reiterating its commitment to defending the Russian homeland from the Ukrainians who started this war. And I was like, oh my God, you want to see propaganda? We've got CF Beauty did a super chat. Thank you for that. Psyops has done 2 super chats. Garth McKeel has done a super chat. Darkest Thinker. Banesh, I think that's right. John Drummond. Some of those are thank you. Some of those are excellent questions. Now, there was a mistake, entirely my fault. I failed to make sure that I had notified General Hodges of how much time we would like of him. He has already exceeded the time that he planned on spending here, so we sincerely appreciate him giving us a little more time than he had anticipated. I'm not going to go into all of the super chats, and I do apologize for that. That's really actually just my fault. I failed to discuss that with him in advance myself appropriately. So it's also a great excuse to say we have to have him back. So hopefully he'll be willing to come back, and we can have him on and we can ask more questions. I would like to thank everybody who has given us a like, everybody who has shared the stream, and everybody who has super chatted. I am going to read one super chat, and then I want to talk about one last thing before we go. But this super chat, I would like to ask a simple question: is the A-10 the sound of American freedom?
Well, I remember the first time I heard it on an exercise, and I thought that was the coolest thing I had ever heard. So there is something unique about it. And, we had A-10 supporting us in Afghanistan as late as 2010. But I don't know. I wouldn't be against providing them to Ukraine, but I think in that environment with the air defense that the Russians have, I think it would be very, very dangerous for any pilot attempting to get in close with an A-10. Nick, if you'll allow me real quickly, first of all, when I saw 90 minutes, I thought, there's no way. I've never heard of a podcast that went that long. And yet you were right. I have been astounded and impressed with how many people have hung with this. And I know that this is the norm for you guys. So my hat's off to you. And that says something about the quality of your audience too, that they are interested and willing to participate in these kind of things. And I'm grateful that you gave me the chance. My only correction to anything that you said, the headquarters for U.S. Army is Europe, is Wiesbaden, Germany. I think you call it Weissband or some shit like that, but it's Wiesbaden.
No, I appreciate it. It's important to get these things correct. So, and as a fan of foreign language, we take this very seriously. We've been doing this podcast for a while, and we're an educational channel, so it's something we want to make sure our audience gets the best information possible, and we're proud of that. And obviously, getting you was very important to that. You will certainly be invited back. But before you go, you are a senior advisor to the Human Rights First, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan international human rights organization. Could you tell us, please, a little bit about this organization, your job there, and why you've decided to spend your free time working with this organization?
So thanks for that. I'm 65 now, and I enjoyed the 4.5 years I was at CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis, where I started right after I retired. I live in Frankfurt, but I was working for CEPA, which is based in D.C., and it had a very specific focus on Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region, which I loved. But after 4.5 years, that was time I needed to broaden my horizons a little bit, frankly, and I wanted to do some things that were not just security related, and I wanted to, even at the ripe old age of 65, get outside my comfort zone. And so I had a friend who was on the board at Human Rights First, and he said, hey, we could create a position for you as senior advisor where, to be candid, I don't look, or my profile is not typical for human rights organizations. Yeah. I've had a lot of people say, you're in Human Rights First? I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I spent 40 years protecting human rights. But I mean, I get it. And there's 3 strands of work there that I do at HRF that I find fascinating and important, and they have stretched me personally and professionally. Number one is I took an oath to the Constitution over and over and over and over throughout my career. since I became a cadet back in 1976. And so I believe in everything that's in that Constitution, to include voting. And so I got concerned about any restrictions on voting or attempts to restrict access to voting. So I've taken an interest in working on that. The second thing is countering extremism. And, you know, when it's very uncomfortable, but we have more of an extremist problem in the military than I thought we did, or that I wanted to admit. And so I think this is something that needs to be addressed. And it turns out that extremist organizations tend to go after soldiers or sailors or Marines shortly after they get out, whether they're first or 1 or 2 term guys or career guys. And so trying to counter that. And then the third thing is accountability. That's why I'm writing this op-ed about supporting the ICC, encouraging the Secretary of Defense to support the ICC in collecting forensic evidence for these of these war crimes. I think accountability is an important part of defending the international rules-based order. And of course, for the United States, if we don't live up to our own talking points, then I think our credibility is also at stake.
Are you optimistic about the state of the world as it is for the next, say, 10 or 15 years? Are you pessimistic, or is the jury still out in your mind?
So, the God's honest truth, I see enough good quality people that are willing to work hard at it that I remain optimistic. But I've also seen enough bad stuff that reminds me that none of this is free. It doesn't just happen. It takes quality women and men who are committed to fighting for all the stuff we care about. And of course, education, media. I mean, more and more I look at our system, our Constitution, the more impressed I am with the design. But even with the design, you still have to have the right people in there, and you've got to force all 3 of the branches of government to live up to their obligations.
Sir, thank you very much for joining us on In Time today. We really appreciate it.
I enjoyed working with all 3 of you and your audience. Thanks very much.
So next week we will have Rick from Ukraine. He dubs the interviews with Russian POWs captured by Ukraine so that we can hear from their own stories what Russian POWs have to say about how and why they enlisted, what the mood is in Russia, and what their fears and hopes are going forward. That will be Rick from Ukraine exactly 1 week from today at the same time. Join us on the Discord if you want to learn more. Commander McMillan is on our Discord and regularly answers questions. He's been very good about that. So you can talk to him. You can find out what other shows we're doing. And we also cover all sorts of educational topics. We do talk about stochastic terrorism, the unfortunate infiltration of supremacist groups in the U.S. military, and any other sort of topics that are affecting the world. Obviously, Trump has come up more than once. So come join us on the Discord. Like and subscribe is a great way and a free way to help out the show. And if you share this link, share the show with others, helps us out, and hopefully it gets out the word on this information. I'd like to thank Xandering for joining us today, Commander McMillan, and most of all, General Ben Hodges for joining us today. Thank you all for a delightful show.
Thank you.